How did the people approve the new Constitution? Unit number 4, Lesson 18.
The Federalists were for the Constitution and the Antis were against. The Federalists said, hey, the Articles of Confederation was so messed up that we needed to get rid of it and write a new plan for government, while the Antis said, no, let's just fix the original version. The Federalists were in favor of this concept that we discussed before, known as federalism, in which power would be shared between a strong central government and the state governments, whereas the Antis wanted the state governments to hold almost all of the power and to have a very weak national government. Again, the Federalists wanted a large central government and the Antis wanted a small one. And this last line tells us who was likely to be a Federalist, and that was the wealthy merchants. And the Antis were usually small, not poor, but less rich farmers. Again, these are overviews, and there was plenty of people who didn't fit into stereotypes, but that's basically who your everyday Federalist and Anti-Federalist was.
How did Madison plan to get the people to approve the new Constitution? Madison planned to get the people to approve the new Constitution by going to the states and holding special conventions to have the people vote themselves. What reasons might some delegates have given for leaving the convention and refusing to sign the Constitution? The delegates would have left and refused to sign the Constitution because they didn't agree with what was included in the document. Why do you suppose Congress or the state legislators might have rejected the Constitution if they had been asked to ratify it? Because they had just fought off a tyrannical form of government and they do not want another one. Why do you suppose Madison wanted to have the Constitution ratified by delegates to state conventions elected directly by the people? Because he wanted to make sure it was the people's decision and state and local governments are closer to the people. In what way was Madison's plan an example of a social contract? In the way that he's letting the people decide to let the government protect their freedom and trusting them to not become tyrannical in doing so. In 1789, the Constitution was ratified by 9 states. The people gave their consent to a social contract to create a national government and obey its laws. Are people today responsible for honoring that contract? Why? Yes, of course people are still responsible for following the Constitution. It's the supreme law of the land and it has not been changed. What is the Federalist? Who wrote it? Why is it important? The Federalists are a series of articles that Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote for a New York newspaper supporting the ratification of the new Constitution. The Federalist is one of the most important explanations of constitutional government ever written.
Over the course of the struggle for ratification, an extraordinary number of essays, speeches, letters, and other commentaries were printed. Of them all, the most remarkable were a series of 85 essays that first appeared in various newspapers in New York in the fall of 1787 into the spring of 1788. Those essays supporting the Constitution were written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. They were soon published in book form as The Federalist, a commentary on the Constitution of the United States. All of the essays bore the pen name Publius, Latin for public man, and they were reprinted throughout the 13 states. They remain an excellent commentary on the Constitution.
Do you think a Bill of Rights would cause intense debate today? Why or why not? I think a Bill of Rights would definitely cause intense debate today. I think nowadays people are more educated on government and everyone has different opinions on things. There are some people that wouldn't allow some of these freedoms to be given. Does a system of checks and balances make it impossible for any one branch of government to dominate the others? Why or why not? I believe the system of checks and balances does give a way for one branch to have more power or dominate the others. The one branch I believe has the most power is the executive, due to them having the right to pass executive orders and having the Presidential Directive 51.
Over the past several years, substantial power has been granted to the president and the executive branch. One such example of extreme power is National Security Presidential Directive 51, which was created by President George W. Bush in May of 2007. Directive 51 says that when the president considers an emergency to have occurred, an enduring constitutional government comprising a cooperative effort among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of the federal government, coordinated by the president, will take the place of the nation's regular government. The goal of Directive 51 is to ensure the continuity of federal government in the case of an emergency. They define these emergencies as any incident, regardless of location, that results in extraordinary levels of mass casualties, damage, or disruption severely affecting the U.S. population, infrastructure, environment, economy, or government functions. This policy would also create a new National Continuity Coordinator inside the White House. They would be charged with ensuring all executive agencies have a plan to keep functioning if their leadership becomes unable to fulfill their duties. To put it simply, if an emergency happens anywhere in the world that could negatively impact the U.S., the president would be able to implement a new government to replace our existing one and grant themselves extreme executive authority. Before Directive 51, it would have been up to FEMA to handle these situations, but this power has now been handed over to the White House. Worst of all, Directive 51 does not specify what the legal limits of this power will be, and not even Congress has been allowed to challenge it. The United States was founded with a system of checks and balances in place within the federal government. No one branch was to be more powerful than the other. But as time goes on, more and more authority is being granted to the executive branch. It would seem that our checks and balances are not working, and we're coming to the point where we have to say, it's time to draw the line.
What compromise did Federalists finally agree to make in order to get enough support for the Constitution to be ratified? The compromise the Federalists and Anti-Federalists finally agreed on was to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists felt they needed it to protect people against the power of the national government. Does the Constitution give the national government too much power? Federalists, no, it doesn't give the national government too much power. It doesn't allow to deprive people of their rights, and it only gives limited power to do certain things. Anti-Federalists, yes. Since there isn't a Bill of Rights, the government is free to violate them. Americans recently fought a war to secure their fundamental rights. They don't want a constitution that places those rights in jeopardy. Does the Constitution provide for a republican government? Federalists, a large republic where power is divided between the national and state governments is a better solution. It is also better to organize government based on checks and balances. Under such a government, it will be more difficult for special interests to work against the common good. Anti-Federalists. People who are not too rich or too poor are more likely to have civic virtue. Some people are more likely to agree on what is best for their common good. The new nation would be too large and diverse. The people will not be able to agree on their common welfare. Does the Constitution need to have a Bill of Rights? Federalists, a Bill of Rights is not needed. The Constitution is the ultimate protection for the people's rights, and the people are the ultimate sovereigns. The Constitution does not give government the power to deprive people of their rights. Anti-Federalist, a Bill of Rights is necessary to protect people against the power of the national government. There is no mention of the First Amendment rights. Since these rights/freedoms are not in the Constitution, government is free to violate them. What do you think were the best arguments for ratifying the Constitution? One argument for ratifying the Constitution is they would explain how the new government was good and wouldn't dominate because the power of the national government is separated into three as a safeguard. What were the best arguments against ratifying the Constitution? One of the arguments against the ratification is that they had just finished fighting to get out of a tyrannical form of government and they did not want to get caught in another. What might have happened to the country if the states had not ratified the Constitution? I think that the states would have split because tension would have built between them, and it probably would have ended in another civil war. Why did the framers oppose submitting the Constitution to the existing Congress or state governments for ratification? The framers opposed submitting the Constitution to the existing Congress or state governments for ratification because they had just fought to get out of a tyrannical form of government and they did not want another one, and they wanted to make sure it was the people's decision. What process did the framers select for ratifying the Constitution? How did the preamble to the Constitution help them decide on this method? The framers' process for ratifying the Constitution was to go to the state and have special conventions for the people to vote. The preamble to this Constitution helped them to decide this process by the start. We the people do ordain and establish the Constitution. So they wanted the people to vote themselves. What arguments did the Anti-Federalists make against ratifying the Constitution? Some arguments the Anti-Federalists had against the ratification was the mistrust of government in general and strong national government in particular. They feared the flaws they saw in the Constitution would be a threat to their natural rights. The new nation would be too big for a republican government. There is no mention of the First Amendment freedoms. Since these freedoms are not in the Constitution, government is free to violate them. They finished fighting to get out of a tyrannical form of government. They did not want to go through that again. The Federalists respond to the criticism of the Constitution made by the Anti-Federalists. Federalists responded to the criticism of the Constitution made by the Anti-Federalists by giving them the Bill of Rights they insisted on having in order to sign the new Constitution. The Anti-Federalists lost their battle to prevent adoption of the Constitution. Their struggle, however, permanently shaped the new Constitution. Explain how the ideas and concerns of the Anti-Federalists accomplished this. Why was this struggle important? Why is it relevant today? The way the Anti-Federalists had shaped the new Constitution is by having the Bill of Rights. This struggle was important because they gave us the Bill of Rights. This is relevant today because it still gives us our rights listed in the Bill of Rights, like the First Amendment and Second Amendment. Explain how the ratification process provided a widespread political debate about an important political decision. The ratification process provided a widespread political debate about an important political decision because it completely changed the form of government from a confederacy to a republican/federal government.
September of 1787, the Constitution was complete and ready for ratification. Almost. Ratification means to make something official by signing it or voting for it. And to ratify the Constitution and make it the supreme law of the land, 9 of the 13 states had to approve of it. In the end, it took more than a year and a half to get 11 states to ratify and nearly 2.5 years to get all 13 to ratify. During this time, 2 opposing groups emerged, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were in favor of ratification. They felt the Constitution was already complete as it was, and were in favor of a strong central or national government to keep the country running smoothly. The Federalists were mostly wealthy businessmen living in large trading cities along the coast. They included the Founding Fathers, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, and John Marshall. They explained how the Constitution would work by publishing a series of newspaper articles known as the Federalist Papers under the false name Publius. The Anti-Federalists were against ratification of the Constitution. They feared a strong central government would be too much like a king and wanted a Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution that would guarantee people the freedoms they had fought so hard for in the Revolution. They were less organized than the Federalists and consisted of common people living in both the cities and the countryside. Some of the better-known Anti-Federalists include John Adams, Samuel Adams, George Clinton, and Patrick Henry. At this time, only Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut had voted in favor, giving the Constitution only 5 of the 9 states needed to ratify. The Federalists realized that to get the other states to ratify, they were going to have to add a Bill of Rights. After promising the addition of a Bill of Rights, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire cast their votes. With 9 out of 13 states on board, the Constitution wasn't ratified for the entire country, but did go into effect in those 9 states. At this point, the 2 biggest and most economically important states had yet to ratify, Virginia and New York. George Washington, Edmund Randolph, and James Madison worked hard to convince Virginia to ratify, while Alexander Hamilton set his sights on New York. A few months later, in the summer of 1788, Virginia and New York officially voted to ratify the Constitution, bringing the count to 11. Though North Carolina and Rhode Island eventually came around, with 11 out of 13 states, the Constitution was ratified and became the supreme law of the land.
Arguments for the Constitution. Once the Constitution was created, it was sent out to the states to be ratified or approved. And when it was set out, both sides argued for and against the Constitution. Federalists were supporters of the Constitution. They believed it offered a fair balance of power. They thought the Constitution offered a careful compromise on key political issues. If you remember, we learned about the Great Compromise and the 3/5 Compromise last week. And those were just 2 of a handful of compromises made in order to settle those regional differences. Some of the Federalists included James Madison, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. Federalists tended to be wealthy farmers, lawyers, and landowners. Arguments against the Constitution. There were Federalists that were for the Constitution. Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution. They opposed the Constitution, and they did not want a new government. They wanted to stay with the Articles of Confederation because they thought the Constitution gave too much power to the central government. They wanted protection for individual rights. At this point, the Constitution, when it was sent out for ratification, had no Bill of Rights. Those first 10 amendments that the United States is so proud of were not a part of the Constitution that was set out to be ratified. So anti-federalists were really afraid that if they created this central government that was so powerful over the states without individual rights being protected, that all the rights and freedoms they had fought for and stood up for would be destroyed. Some anti-federalists included Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, and George Mason, and many anti-federalists were small farmers and debtors.